Hi, and welcome to Geo-Interesting. I'm your host, Abby Mulberg. Prior to the end of World War I, President Wilson gathered a group of expert geographers, historians, economists, and political scientists to make plans for the coming Paris Peace Conference in 1919. The group was known as the Inquiry. Their job? To produce a secret document, the Black Book, containing maps and plans for the territorial settlements to be negotiated. This secret plan was brought daily by the president into negotiations and went on to greatly influence final policy decisions made in Paris. The Black Book provided a critical role in redrawing the map of the world. Dr. Wesley Reisser addresses this largely unstudied segment of history in The Black Book, Woodrow Wilson's Secret Plan for Peace. Dr. Reisser, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're currently up to?
Yeah, so I have been with the Department of State for the last 20 years, including while I did my PhD at UCLA, which is what led to the research that ultimately led to my first book. I've been at NGA since mid-August on a short joint duty assignment from the State Department as I go through the Senior Executive Service Candidate Development Program. And as a part of that program, they ask folks to spend about 4 months in a totally different part of the US government than where they worked. But as a PhD geographer, I thought nowhere could be more interesting and more fun than NGA. So I've been working in the Office of International Affairs here, and I'm having a great time.
So you've made yourself right at home.
100%. Very different culture than state, but I really feel like I'm among my people here.
So what was it about the work of the Inquiry that made you want to tell this story?
Well, actually, when I was doing my master's in geography, my advisor at the time had me read a book that had come out called Paris 1919 that was a bestseller about the Paris Peace Conference. And that particular book kept talking about the secret plans that were used. And I could tell that no one involved in that book, and then I picked up several others, and those books all talked about it as well, but none of them had ever seen them. And I got really interested because the whole thrust of what happened at the end of World War I was different than prior wars, where the war would end and the winning side gobbled up lots of territory from the losing side, right? And that was the norm of kind of how interstate politics worked. And when the US entered World War I, President Wilson put out what were called the 14 points, and they really laid out a different set of rules of the road that have become the rules of the road ever since. And I really wanted to see, okay, how do you take some concepts like that and actually turn that into a real plan? Because 14 bullet points is very different than an international treaty that's going to run for hundreds or thousands of pages and is agreed by a whole lot of different countries. So I was really interested in how the inquiry came about, and specifically about what they put forward to the president. And the thing that was the most exciting and interesting to me about the inquiry was where it sat. The intelligence community didn't exist in 1917, right? There was a very tiny cadre of individuals involved in anything beyond military intelligence here in the United States at that time. And so there wasn't a good place to go to kind of do this. And so the US government actually outsourced this work and headquartered it at the American Geographical Society in New York City. And the head of the AGS was a man named Dr. Isaiah Bowman, who was a geographer. I'm actually on the board of the American Geographical Society as one of the US government reps. And so I wasn't at the time, though. But I knew about the AGS, and I was really interested to see, how an outside organization as well, especially one led by geographers, could help influence policy in such a meaningful way.
So these geographers and other experts were tasked with taking a scientific approach to redrawing the boundaries of Europe to help prevent future conflicts. So how did they go about it, and what were they aiming for to scientifically redraw the boundaries?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And, I think at the time, scientifically would have been done without scare quotes around it. And now I think we would probably put those quotes around the word scientific. They're really in the early 20th century was this very kind of progressive view at the time that there were scientific answers to every problem. And that if you just threw enough theories and data at something, then you could get to a perfect answer. And, that's great for things like new medicine that you're going to take, or now building, a rocket that's going to take people back to the moon or something like that. But human behavior is really hard to quantify scientifically well, and human expectations. And even what is the right data is a challenge. But what they did at the time was they used the best data and information that they could get. Most of the changes in borders that happened at the end of World War I were in Europe and the Middle East. There were also a lot of proposals to make changes in Africa, but Germany and Austria-Hungary were not major African powers like Britain and France. And it's kind of hard to convince countries that want a war to get rid of their territory, to decolonize any of those things. So none of that actually ended up happening. But what we could do at the time was dig up the data that existed. And the thing that was pretty good in Europe, especially compared to many other parts of the world, was census data. And the census data, even at that time, asked a lot of the same questions that now we can draw upon from modern census data. What language do you speak? What's your religion? Sometimes, what is your ethnic identity? And we could map that out. And of course, the borders of these empires looked nothing like that census data. And so what they did was try to correlate national identity to census data. The unfortunate reality sometimes of that, of course, is the language you speak at home or your religion may not actually be the identity of which nation you identify with. I think a really great example of that right now is even the war in Ukraine, where a lot of folks kind of assumed, if you speak Russian, or if you're Orthodox instead of Eastern Rite Catholic, then you're probably fine with the Russians showing up, and maybe you actually want to be a part of Russia. And we've seen that, the overwhelming majority of those people, they have census data points that would say maybe they'd rather be in Russia than Ukraine. Nothing could be further from the truth, right? So they were trying to do this, but I think now we have a better understanding than they did then of the challenges inherent in that.
So it sounds like this approach didn't go exactly as planned. Do you think it ended up helping in any way? Did it calm? Did it exasperate tensions?
Yeah, I think what's really, really interesting is the peace settlements are the first attempt to change borders at the end of a conflict, specifically in a manner that is informed by data. Every peace process that has followed since has also tried to rely on data to help influence the decisions that were made. And I do think that it is a good thing, especially relative to what was there. My book is called The Black Book, Woodrow Wilson Secret Plan for Peace. It's based on my doctoral dissertation. The title of that was From a World of Empires to a World of Nation States, America at the Paris Peace Conference. And I think that world of empires to world of nation states is an important way to think about what these changes influenced and why they were really important and are still incredibly important today. Part of that is Europe was mostly dominated by just a handful of really big countries, right? The British Empire, the French Empire, the German Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Two of those empires didn't even exist after 1919. The Russian Empire collapsed, large parts of it became independent, and the rest, after a really nasty civil war, turned into the Soviet Union. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire was splintered up into a lot of pieces, as was the Ottoman Empire that was already starting to fall apart before the war even broke out. So a lot of countries came into existence either for the first time or again at the end of World War I. I think the one that President Wilson was probably the most proud of was the reemergence of an independent Polish state, which had been gobbled up in the 1700s by Germany, Russia, and Austria through a series of partitions until there was no more Poland. And population-wise, that was the largest nationality in Europe to not have its own country at that point. When the Austro-Hungarian Empire broke up, you get Czechoslovakia, You get the formation of Yugoslavia, an idea that seemed to not work out so well over the longer term. And then you get a separate Hungary, a separate Austria. Germany gets smaller. So there's a lot of different changes that occur. In my book, I actually break up the boundary discussion, looking at what we brought to the table, how we got there, and what it led to, into 3 different sections. One part are things the US brought to the table that we still have on the world map today. Second category is things that we brought to the table that were achieved and then changed or disappeared later. And then the third is the things that we never got. And in that first category, I think there are still significant borders today across Europe that are where they are today because those are the borders that the United States proposed, whether for better or for worse. So Alsace and Lorraine, areas that switched back and forth between the French and the Germans for a very long time. That border between Germany and France today is the very border that the US brought to the table at the end of World War I. The current borders of Belgium and the Netherlands and Luxembourg are also sit right along those lines for better. Maybe on the for worse side, although, ask each individual, the border between Italy and Austria shifted north to not follow what you would expect scientifically, like ethnic data or something of that nature, and instead to a hydrologic boundary, which is certainly a scientific boundary. But because of that, there's a pretty large region that used to be called South Tyrol. Now it's the Trentino, way up north of Venice, along the Austrian border, where there's a huge German population sitting in Italy. If you watch the Winter Olympics and see the Italian skiers, about half of them have German names, and they all come from there. And everybody still speaks German, and it's not a part of Austria, which is kind of weird. But we asked for that. We got that. Quite a few other examples, but those are some of the most concrete and easy ones, I think, to imagine. And of course, the creation of Poland is another, although the borders of Poland today look very different than the borders of Poland 1920. On the what we got and then went away, I think I alluded to Yugoslavia as an example. There's so many different nationalities in the Western Balkans, a lot of them very small populations, historically had not had their own country. And so the Kingdom of Serbia already existed during World War I, and they had been pushing kind of this pan-Slavic identity. We thought that was probably right, with the information that you have. You make decisions, and Yugoslavia actually, for a long time, was a pretty major player in Europe until its collapse in the mid-1990s. But that is one example. Another, Czechoslovakia, also existed for a pretty good chunk of time, split apart peacefully, in 1994, but obviously another place where the map has changed. And then the places where we never got what we want, I think there's kind of 2 factors to that, because the story of World War I and America's role in the peace conference at like the high school world history textbook level, where you get maybe a paragraph, right, is Wilson professed all these wonderful ideas in the 14 points, and we didn't get all of them. Therefore, it's a huge failure. And I assess instead that even though we didn't get everything, we actually got a lot. The U.S. came to the war late, 1917. The war broke out in 1914. Millions and millions of British and French casualties on the Western Front. For the United States, it was the second bloodiest war we had ever fought at that point. World War II has now overtaken it, but it is the 3rd deadliest conflict actually in American history. But our total number of combat deaths in World War I was under 150,000 compared to millions of British and millions of French casualties. So they felt like they should have a pretty big say in where things were and not just the Johnny-come-lately to the conflict. So we didn't get everything that we asked for. And I think some of those places where we didn't, and the view of failure, at least on the geographic side, is kind of pointed to, are in places like the Middle East, where British and French colonies actually expand into former Ottoman territory even further after World War I, or in Africa, where the only thing that happens is German colonies get taken over by either Britain or France. So like Tanzania had been a German colony, becomes British. Namibia had been a German colony, becomes British, right? So those sorts of changes happen over the objections of the United States. But, we come to this now with a perspective as maybe we're not the sole superpower anymore, but we certainly have been the preeminent global power since the end of the Cold War all by ourselves. And it leads to a certain, I think, kind of thought process among Americans that's like, well, if we want something, we get it. But the US was still just emerging onto the global stage at the end of World War I. We had stayed out of the Eastern Hemisphere. We had the Monroe Doctrine. The US was very active in the Western Hemisphere. And we really were pretty isolationist otherwise about the world. And you can't just go from that to dictating everything that happens in the world. So I think some of those challenges and a lot of the failures that we see coming out of World War I that lead to World War II, and then on to the Balkan Wars and some of these other conflicts that are still a legacy of that same conflict, really don't lie at the feet of the United States.
Knowing how cultures and languages continue to blend our technological advances, connect the world, how has the role of geography changed in policy decision, and what do you think it will look like in the future?
Well, I see kind of two sides to that. And one thing sitting here at NGA right now that thrills me is actually to see so many young people coming into the field again. And there's just an enormous cadre of human geographers that are working here at NGA, and more students studying geography and geospatial technology and things all across the US that will hopefully be influencing the foreign policy decisions of the future. I actually think a lot of the problems that the US has faced in its foreign policy in the post-World War I era up to the modern time is due to a level of geographic ignorance. And I think a lot of folks sitting here at NGA probably understand this really well too, that not even every state requires students to study geography to graduate from high school. That's starting to change with the AP Human Geography curriculum, and now AP Environmental Science, which really has a link to physical geography, that more and more students are starting to study that because they want the AP credit. But there has been a real disconnect. And so sitting inside the State Department, I run into very few geographers in the policy side of state where I work. So I don't work in the Office of the Geographer at State. I've worked in various policy offices. My assignment that I'll be returning to from NGA is working on human rights and humanitarian issues at the United Nations. And I'm often the only American geographer in the room. And geography, I think, has such a unique way of looking at problems, right? Political scientists and economists take kind of these grand theories and apply them to all kinds of parts of the world, I think kind of ham-handedly, whereas geographers really understand the nuance that every single place in the world is unique, and it has a unique set of physical and human characteristics, right? It has its unique climate, access to fresh water, access to ports, connections for trade. And then on the human side, it has its own mixture, right? Not a single group of people live anywhere. Maybe you go to Iceland and almost everybody's Icelandic, right? There's a few exceptions to that. But in most places in the world, right, we have this mix of people who come from different places. We know the languages they speak, the religions that they practice, the jobs that they have. What are their linkages? And a lot of the new geospatial technology makes us able to study these flows, right? Flows of people, flows of goods, flows of information, flows of money that can help us understand how each spot on the globe looks in its own unique way and how it fits into that broader puzzle. And so I think as that information floods more onto the desks of those senior policymakers, right, be that the president, the secretary of state, the secretary of defense, et cetera, that all of this geospatial knowledge is going to dramatically change the way that we think about challenges in the world, and especially how we think about how the United States should respond to those challenges, how the United States should plan for contingencies for the future. And NGA, I think, is at the core of that mission. And it's really, I think, in a lot of ways, an incredibly exciting time where we can visualize and study this data and information from the geographic lens in ways that we couldn't even imagine a decade or two ago. So I have a lot of great hope for sort of the future of geography, and especially for the future role that that geographic information and geographic modes of thinking can impact the way that we study the world we live in. But for me, as a government practitioner, and not just an academic who writes books about things that happened 100 years ago, which are really important, but working on the present day, I think that the toolkit that we bring just really has a lot of remarkable ability to help understand the world, plan for the future, and hopefully we can use that information to make better informed decisions for where we go from here.
In researching for the Black Book, you came across some of the original maps from the inquiry. What was that like, and where are they now?
Well, there is nothing more fun. As a geographer and a history nerd, I have an undergraduate degree in history as well, than finding old maps. And I think a lot of people who find their way to geography partly find their way to it because as a kid, you either got those map inserts in National Geographic, or maybe your family had an atlas or a globe, and you would just spend all this time looking at them and thinking about these other places, and with historic maps, other times, right? To think about how the world looked at other times in the past. So for this book, what was really exciting was I kept seeing references to Woodrow Wilson's little black book, and it was pretty clear that it was like a black binder that had some plans and a whole lot of maps in it, because all of the history books that talk about the negotiations and the firsthand accounts as well that I read of the negotiations at Paris from other members of the US and the British delegation made it really clear that he had these maps and that they were being used all the time. So I started doing some digging around to figure out, all right, where is it? Because you could look in the catalog of the Library of Congress or major research libraries that tended to have these sorts of materials. Wilson predates the presidential library era. So I couldn't just go to the Wilson Presidential Library like you could do if you wanted to do Cuban Missile Crisis. You just go to the Kennedy Library and it's all in one place in Boston and it's really easy to find, right? And so I, at first, stumbled upon, in the State Department library, a really interesting thing. And that was the legal advisor of state was one of the key members of the US delegation. And when he got back to Washington, he had all of his documents and his notes bound into volumes that got shoved on a shelf. And they were sitting in the State Department library with the other World War I stuff. They were totally covered in dust. I don't think anyone had looked at them in decades. And after his diary were all of his briefing papers and books. So I started going through all of them, and a few volumes in, stumbled upon a 120-page document that had been bound into this bigger book that was full of maps, and it talked about the outline of the peace terms. And as soon as I started digging through it, I realized I had actually found a copy of the so-called Black Book, and I had its name. That was the most important thing, right? To find other copies, to make sure, is this really the thing? And so I was able to take that name and cross-reference, and I found Wilson's copy, which was at the Library of Congress, and I found the manuscript copy. So Isaiah Bowman, who was the head of the inquiry and as a geographer, went on after that to become the president of Johns Hopkins University. And all of his papers were up in Baltimore. So I went up to Baltimore, and they pulled the box that had all of his World War I documents in it. And sure enough, that copy had the pen and ink original border proposal maps that had then been made into the additional copies, including the one I found at the Library of Congress and the one that I found at State. And it's really cool to find an old map. It's even cooler to find the manuscript copy of that map, right? That is the one where, it had the printed map with the hand-drawn lines, because that's how they did it back then, right? You couldn't go into GIS and click and make some lines and create a new shapefile, and there you go, right? People actually had to use pen and ink to do the first copy. So I found that, and then I found a whole host of other maps. Hopkins digitized everything of their copies for me. State didn't have the right things in their library, and they let me take all of those maps as well as the big format maps, which were next to the legal advisor's books, in a box. There's just this box sitting on the shelf. I opened it up, and it was full of folded up huge maps that were like 2-3 feet by by another 2-3 feet each way. And so I took all those things over across the street to the geography department at GW. We digitized all of these things. I actually did create shapefiles for some of these once upon a time. Doing historic GIS work is really hard, and there aren't a lot of people who do it. I don't recommend it unless you're really detail-oriented and you like to scan in something and trace thousands of points with a mouse, click, 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 all the way around. But I did do that for a few to be able to line up the U.S. proposals against the borders that were created and the modern borders and be able to look at some of these things. But it was just one of those like really lucky breaks to find these things and be able to chase down, where is this stuff now? What actually happened to it? I think a lot of the prior authors who had worked on this just assumed that they were lost. And it was partly because there was nothing in there called by the name that they were finding in the various diaries and papers that they were reviewing to write their papers. But with a little bit of sleuthing, you can usually figure these things out. And as a geographer, to be the person who rediscovered it, it was really cool. And also it was really a great privilege to then be able to take these documents, which of course at the time they didn't use the term top secret, but it was essentially a top secret book, right? Because it was a presidential briefing book that was being used for high-level negotiations. These documents were not widespread. As far as I can tell, there were less than 10 copies of the Black Book made for the Paris Peace Conference. So it was an incredibly limited distribution that this thing went to. And to be able to take those maps and now be able to put them out into the public domain where people can see them and really see what we brought to the table was a really exciting and fun thing to get to do.
Was there anything on those maps that surprised you when you found them?
One of the surprises was what we asked for in places that we didn't get anything. I had assumed that the US was mostly focused on Western and Central Europe and the Balkans because those were the places that kind of dominated all the other books on the Paris Peace Conference. And they are what most of the time in negotiation was spent on. It was fascinating to see how much we had prepared for contingencies for other parts of the world that could have come up and didn't end up coming up in the peace settlement. So that was one big surprise. Another surprise was a lot of the places where we didn't get quite the lines we asked for. I think what the US came to the table with was better than what actually ended up on the border. I think we asked for borders that would have been better. I think a lot of folks now kind of talk about it like, well, there could have been a perfect solution, right? And you still hear this, all the time when there's a conflict. Oh, well, if the border was just blah, then we wouldn't have this conflict, which imagines a world, first of all, where there's no overlapping of populations, right? So go down to South Texas, right? If we actually redrew the border based on where people speak Spanish versus speak English, well, one, the border would move north, right? So the US would actually lose territory. But two, go into those cities. There's tons of English and Spanish speakers, right? There's tons of Mexican Americans. There's tons of Americans of other backgrounds all living in these places together, right? There isn't a perfect border. And if you gave every nation a state, we would have somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 countries on this planet. Is that manageable? Can we give a tribal nation that has 200 people a country and a seat at the UN? I suppose we can. But the politics of all of this, and imagine, how do you provide for security? How do you provide for an economy? How do you have trade? How do you manage relations between that many different entities? It isn't really possible. So I think that is the other big lesson that I took from this is, a lot of even the expectations and ideas we have now are predicated on an impossibility. And that impossibility is built through geographic ignorance, I would argue, more than anything else. So study geography, learn these things, and you're really, I think, going to come out with a much more nuanced understanding of why the world looks like it does and why we continue to face some of the intractable problems that we have.
I think a lot of our audience would agree with you. Well, thank you, Dr. Reisser, for joining us and sharing your passion and knowledge with us. It's been great.
Absolutely my pleasure.